So, you've just played R-Type after reading the earlier review. You're beaten down, beaten up, and feeling really sorry for yourself. When this happens to us, the best way to regain your pride is, of course, to take it out on someone less powerful than you. In that case, give Final Reverse a go. This game feels like something that would have come out in the early 80s, the sort of thing where the entire premise of the game is two players shooting at each other from their own halves of the screen. If you remember Volley Fire, you'll have a kind of idea what I'm talking about. Final Reverse is basically the same thing, with a few different features. You can play horizontally or vertically, and can move within your zone in 4 directions. As you do so, however, a track is created behind you that your movements are limited to. You can plot a track from one side of your playfield to the other, and as long as you don't trap your route in, you can make it as long as you want. Each battle is 2 rounds. You first plot the route in the preliminary round, not my spelling mistake, and then for the final round the 2 routes are switched, hence the final reverse I suppose, so that you get the track your opponent drew and vice versa. I tend to find that sticking to a line parallel to the intersection is best, as the bullets only ever come perpendicular to it, meaning you'll only ever really have to move from side to side. Moving across the middle part is a mirror which, if either ship shoots it, rebounds the bullet back where they came from. The AI is pretty dumb, even at the highest difficulty, and will just pepper you with aimless shots, many of which will fly back at itself. It's not a one-shot affair, you have an energy meter, but even so, the computer sure does make your job easier for you. As well as the mirror, there will be this thing occasionally that looks like a missile silo. It'll fire these 2 orbs out in opposite directions. Destroying these will offer up power-ups to whoever's side of the screen they're on. There are several power-ups to collect, including double shots, bombs, invincibility, and something that you can shoot towards your enemy's tracks to block it. Once collected, you can select these using the B button. The game has several modes, the main of which being a 5-on-5 elimination match. Scroll mode is the same thing, but with a wider screen. The final option is a single battle, rather than the 5-battle tournament. Choose 5 from 9 different ships. The choice is visual only, and the order they'll fight in. You then have one-on-one fights over the 2 rounds, until one team is totally gone. What's silly is the surviving ship's health is totally replenished after each fight, meaning you can easily go the entire 5 matches without losing a ship. And that's the main problem with the game really, it's too easy, meaning there's very little substance or challenge. Honestly, hide in a corner, put the game down, and it'll beat itself. The strength, as with most games like this, lies in playing against another person, and there's a link cable option to do just that. Otherwise, you're playing against some pretty stupid AI that isn't really a challenge. You'll soon be whining the championship. That's also not my spelling mistake, just so you know. Athena weren't renowned for much, let's be honest. They did a bunch of mahjong games, as well as a lot of 10-pin bowling titles, including the underwhelming World Bowling for Game Boy. I suppose this is the next in the World Sports series, although it would be the final entry. World Ice Hockey is far more playable than the aforementioned Skittles simulator, thankfully. You select one of 8 nations with the goal of beating them all to win the cup. Before each game, you can call a meeting, where you can select various tactics for offense, defense, and several other options. It goes into quite a bit of detail, whether as window dressing or as an actual gameplay mechanic, I'm not sure. I don't really notice any change in-game, but then sports tactics are not my forte. There are 3 periods of 20 minutes each. Really, there are around 5 minutes real time, and you don't change ends, you're always shooting to the top of the screen. You pass with B, shooting and tackling with A. You can hold the buttons for a little extra power. Passing is pretty accurate, the puck going roughly in the direction of the nearest teammate, but note that you also have to press B to receive the puck, otherwise it'll pass you straight by. Aiming your shots is more about your placement than the direction you're pressing. Left and right will shoot at a 45-degree angle, so it's more important to make your goal approach in a direct manner. You can tackle, or straight up trip opposing players with A. The game rarely calls an FAUL, as you seem to be able to get away with pretty much anything. If you do happen to fall, however, the ref skates onto the rink and drags you off like a scolded dog. The game moves at what feels like around 75% speed. This is fine, any faster and the blur would have been unmanageable. You can move the puck around your team really fluidly, and the pace to the game is good despite the slowed down aspect of it. When you're on the defensive, you can press B to take control of the nearest player, in the way that, say, FIFA does so well. The music is fast-paced and energetic, although it comes at the expense of any kind of sound effects, which is something of a shame. Graphically, the game shines, especially the scoreboard animations when you manage to score. In tournament mode, the difficulty spikes quite drastically. The first team is a piece of cake to beat, but then the second team definitely brings you back down to earth. All in all, World Ice Hockey is a delight. Sleek, stylish, and oh so playable. Infuriating and entertaining in equal measure. It's a wonder why Athena didn't do more of this sort of thing, as they were obviously pretty good at it. Cavenoire, or Black Wine Cellar in French, is a Japanese-exclusive, procedurally generated dungeon crawler with certain roguelike elements, stripped back to its fundamentals. The qualifying characteristics are all there: randomly generated dungeons and characters moving in a turn-based fashion. This was fast becoming a popular niche, with great titles such as NetHack, Ragnarok, and the Sega duo Dragon Crystal on the Master System, and its bigger brother Fatal Labyrinth on the Mega Drive. However, I challenge you to think of another one on the Game Boy. That's right, there isn't one. Azure Dreams on the Game Boy Color was maybe about as close as it got other than Cavenoire. Where these types of games usually offer permadeath as a feature, where you restart a newly spawned game if you die, and a massive, long dungeon slog from start to finish, Cavenoire is a little gentler on you. The game is split into 4 separate dungeons, each with their own increasingly challenging quests. You can switch between dungeons as you please, and there's no discernible advantage to completing one over another. The quests usually involve killing a certain number of monsters, collecting a certain number of coins or orbs, or freeing a particular number of caged fairies. After you accomplish the quest goal, a door will open somewhere in the dungeon. It may be worth your time to delve a little deeper though, as there's no leveling up system, and your strengths and health can only be increased by finding power-ups in chests. Due to the difficulty increasing above your stats usually, it's also worth strategizing in such a way that you save any potions or spells until the harder parts, and maybe go try to find some after a dungeon has been cleared out. Die on a quest, and you don't need to restart the entire dungeon, just the quest you were last on. In a way, the lack of permadeath feels a little odd for a game like this. Imagine if in The Binding of Isaac you could just restart at the beginning of each floor. There'd be no challenge left. However, that's not to say that Cavenoire is an easy game, because it really isn't. You absolutely need to concentrate on every little move you make, as false steps are often punished, and over-aggressiveness leads you to doom more often than not. Unless you need to clear a dungeon of monsters, it's usually best to calculate your steps so as to avoid them if you can, as there are no experience points and very few item drops to be had. Of course, you can't always dodge everything. Some floors are not expansive and consist of a mere footbridge, leaving you with not much choice but to strike out at the numerous ghosts, snakes, dragons and such. You're not completely useless though. At the start of each level, the magical Kirby tree fills 4 of your 8 inventory slots with some tools for you. There's usually a potion or antidote, as well as a cloak that hides you for a short while, and some aggressive magic like a fireball that kills pretty much anything forthwith. Like I say, preserve these unless you're desperate, as pickups are rare. Items really aren't as prominent a feature as other games in this style, such as Dragon Crystal, where you use spells and scrolls more than your sword. But even so, you can find yourself scrabbling through your meager inventory looking for something to help you out. Each quest takes no more than a few minutes, and with a battery backup and unlimited attempts, death isn't really that much of a frustration. This can lead you to being a little more cavalier in your playstyle, but it's not really conducive to success. The randomly generated nature of the game means you rely on luck of the draw a good deal. Sometimes you can cruise through levels unopposed, whereas other times a supremely powerful monster can spawn right next to you. Occasionally you'll descend some stairs into a room that appears to have no exit. If this happens, just walk up to the walls until a secret passage opens up. They do exist, but not in such a way that makes you need to look at all the walls. The location of them is virtually always implied, and they never hide any treasure. Musically and graphically, the game is fantastic. Each dungeon has its own theme song, and the sound effects really suit the combat sequences. The game looks brilliant for what it is, with fog of war in places and comical but still quite sinister looking enemies. The whole experience is quite delightful and, in retrospect, probably still playable without being able to read Japanese, as there's not much of a story anyway, and once you learn what the use items are, then it'll become second nature. An utterly bizarre action game here. You play as the chubby little Chacha-Maru who has to slide around these ice platforms, knocking great slabs of something into the water without falling off the platform yourself. I can't tell you why you're doing this, you just are, okay? As you'd expect, the movement is incredibly slippery, but in quite a satisfying way. Momentum is reserved nicely, and once you get used to it, you've got decent control over your speed and direction. You just need to knock the grey blocks off the edge. You can ignore the black ones. Occasionally there will be other chaps in there with you, sentient boulders that trundle back and forth getting in your way. They don't target you as such, but you can rebound off of them and fly into the water. There might be birds that perch on a block every now and then. If you can knock a block off when it has a visitor, you get more points. Sometimes this boulder with a face will come out. If you can smash it hard enough, the entire level starts quaking and all the blocks fall into the sea, insta-winning the stage. The face buttons don't do anything. Well, A makes your character stick their fat gut out, but it doesn't seem to do anything. Maybe it was meant to increase the rebound amount, who knows. Every 10 stages there is a kind of boss. Now you're not pushing blocks into the water, you have to slam into the boss with enough speed a number of times until it dies. Bear in mind, these pose much more of a threat than any other enemy you've seen up to this point, as they actively fire at you. After each boss stage you get a mini-game where you have to stop a rapidly fluctuating distance counter, and you get propelled along a flat course while some guy sweeps in front of you, curling style. In later levels, this guy reappears, sweeping across some of the courses and reducing its slipperiness. This is going to be a short review, as I've literally summed up the entire game already. It's not bad, it's not great. Chacha-Maru Panic is pretty good. It's also pretty mad. This was slated to be released in the US by ASCII Entertainment, who allegedly were going to call it Doomsayer: A Hero's Crusade, which is a much more epic title than Little Master: Legend of Raikouban. This spelled the first in a mini-series of Little Master games. The Game Boy had a sequel in 1992, and there was a third on the Super Nintendo in 1995. Half a year before the events of the first game, the evil demon king Gezagane mysteriously started taking over the world, kingdom by kingdom. Now your king comes to you seeking help, with the enemy on your own doorstep. You play Liam, who, along with his band of fierce warriors that include a minotaur named Momo and a sheep called Wool Boy, must defeat the siege and protect your land. Click on a member of your troops to see their movement range. If you get close enough to a foe, you can choose to attack them, and they will retaliate in kind. There's a definite Fire Emblem or Shining Force feel to this game, whereby you can move and then perform an action for each of your characters per turn, then play switches to the opposing side. The ground your character and the enemy rest on has an effect too, with some tiles providing a greater defense boost and so on. The background designs for the fight sequences are faint, but if you look closely you'll see they're actually really well detailed, and the character sprites and animations are quite adorable. The game progresses through each level, or scene, and the aim typically is to defeat all the enemies. At any stage on your turn, you can check out your troops and get a full report on their health, attack and defense stats, how far they can move per turn, amongst other things, which really opens the game up into strategizing your plans. You can also see how much EXP they've earned. Bear in mind that the character that strikes the killing blow on an enemy will get much more experience, so decide whether you're going to evenly level your squad by letting weaker troops finish off enemies. Characters are of several different classes. There are land-based ones, represented by a human. Some can travel on water, and some can fly. The stats balance out. Those more movement limited are probably going to be stronger in other ways. The land provides several obstacles. Trees provide more cover, meaning your defense will go up, at the cost of a slight movement range. Unless your characters can fly, rivers can only be crossed by bridges. Hills will reduce your movement range, and some mountains cannot be passed at all. Keep an eye out for special tiles on the landscape. A 6-pointed star will fully heal a character if they step on it. You really want to seek out the buildings. Quite often you'll rescue other characters who'll then join up with you, bolstering your forces. Other times you'll get a piece of information about the level you're on, advising you to do a certain thing or go to a certain place. One such instance is where a townsperson tells you to take a detour to a temple in the south. You can combine 2 of your troops together if you move them both onto this tile at the same time. Not all combos work. You cannot fuse anything with your main character or the Minotaur, but everything else should work. Do so, and you can either create a stronger version of one of the characters you fused, the other one being sacrificed, or you'll create a much stronger level 1 character. Why should you do this, you ask? If you found the mouse on level 1, you'll appreciate that some starting characters are quite pathetic, and it's only right they should give their puny little lives for the greater good. Plus, no character can get higher than level 8, so before too long, they'll already be as strong as they're ever going to be. Don't be afraid to merge characters together. There's no permadeath. If a character faints in battle, they just run away, you'll get them back on the next stage. You can revisit any completed scenario as well if you want to level up a bit more, which maybe makes the game too easy, but then it's up to you whether you do this or not. Following the game's story path, you get story cutscenes between every level, by the way, leads to a very satisfying difficulty curve that'll start easy but really test your mettle as time goes on. There's so much more I could say about this game, just trust me and play it. This is the first example of a strategy game on the Game Boy that really executes the formula well. If there was a single game I would implore you to download the fan translation of and play from start to finish, it would probably be Little Master. Absolutely outstanding. BattleBots, activate! Super Robot Taisen is a pretty fleshed out series of games at this point, with a ton of entries. Super Robot Wars 30 came out as recently as 2021 on Switch, PS4 and PC. But this is the glorious turn-based strategy game that started it all. Unfortunately, it comes hot on the heels of the first Little Master game, which came out literally the day before this, so it's already got a pretty accomplished contemporary to contend with. Still, Robot Wars the TV show was the bomb back in the day, so let's give it a go. The story goes that the space monster Gilgun has invaded the super robot homeworld, with many succumbing to his thrall. However, a brave and strong few kept their resilience and fought back. Choose from one of 3 squadrons at the start of your game. The first one is Gundam, which brings back some pretty squeamish memories. Even so, I went with Mazinger, more out of principle than anything. Each team has 5 initial members, and their stats vary a little, so experiment to find what you prefer. Once you pick your team, you need to choose which of the 4 is to be the hero, the main character. You can allocate 5 bonus stat points to whomever you choose, so play about with it. The fog of war is quite impactful when you start an episode. It's really difficult not only to know where your enemies are, but also how big the map is, or what general direction to head in. This really should have been more forgiving. The main selling point of games like this is how well you are able to strategize your attack. The genre is literally called strategy, and the lack of the ability of foresight unfortunately hampers the game too much. If you come across towers, make an effort to land one of your troops on it, as these will grant you weapon or armor upgrades. Once you do get into the meat of a battle and the 2 forces have joined, it's actually a pretty strong rendition of a strategy game. You have several choices per character as to what attack you can use. They all have different strengths and ranges. After any attack, there is a retaliatory strike. The land bonuses, obstacles apply, and so on. Unlike most strategy games, the aim here is not necessarily to wipe out the enemy or kill the boss. The enemy forces are guarding towers, and it's your job to overthrow them. Kinda makes it seem like you're the one doing the invading, but whatever. You can enlist enemy units to fight for you if your persuasion stat is high enough. A cool mechanic that I forget exists around 99% of the time. This is the main way to bolster your squad, and you can have up to 12 units at any one time. There is another mechanic called Spirit, and is something only available to your hero character. In later versions of Super Robot Taisen, this was available to all the characters, but here it's just your main. Spirit commands usually are used to massively strengthen your characters by increasing their attack, defense, or agility, that sort of thing, and are best used when you're readying for the final push of taking out the much stronger tower guards. We're in a very similar territory to Little Master from a page or so back. I could talk endlessly about this game as it's that good. Which one I prefer is meted out in the scores I've given them, but the similarities are many. Both Japanese exclusives with many comparative game elements. You'll need to patch the ROM files to get the most out of the games, unless you're fluent in Japanese. Where they are most similar is that they're both bloody brilliant, and I encourage any strategy fan to give them their due. We might be finding a really successful little niche of the Game Boy library here, and I am so here for it. What do you want to know about Mini-Putt? It's literally what it says, a no-frills game of crazy golf. You can select normal game or gamble. The difference being, normal is scored by the usual par system. Gamble, you place wagers and the one with the lowest score wins. Pick how many players you want, 1 to 4, then the course difficulty. Choose from easy, normal, hard, or special. Each 9-hole course is different. No hole is repeated, to the game's credit. Move your cursor to the place you're aiming at, and there's a little number underneath the power bar. This is the distance from the ball that you've put the cursor. If you can match the power bar to something close to that, your shot will reach pretty close to where you're aiming. This is useful for the shots closer to the hole, where you don't want to put too much power on it. The harder part is the left and right swing. It's very difficult to hit this much smaller bar dead center, meaning your shots will be skewed quite often. As long as you're not too far wide, it's pretty generous and doesn't affect the trajectory too greatly. There are arrows on the course. These signify where the slopes are. The darker the ground around the arrow, the steeper these slopes, and the physics are pretty accurate. A couple of minor flaws. The par scores for the majority of the holes are way too low. Some of them even demand that you get it in one. But unless you care about such things, it doesn't affect the game in any way, especially if you're playing against a friend. Secondly, there's no way to time when your guy hits the ball, meaning the opening and closing door obstacles really just boil down to a hit and hope kind of thing. You can't anticipate when they'll be open unless you're Rain Man and can make those sorts of calculations on the fly. To be honest, it's crazy golf and wasn't meant to be taken too seriously. You'll probably enjoy this if you're at all into daft games of skill. Help, help! Yep, another damsel has been kidnapped. This time, you're a sumo wrestler. Moving swiftly on then. For such a massive Rikishi, the fellow's pretty soft. You take damage really easily from the mindlessly approaching enemies, with little invulnerability between hits. Timing is key. You jump with the A button, the height of which is determined by the length of time you hold the button. B does your palm attack thing, which turns into a shoulder toss, causing your aggressors to comically fly off the top of the screen. I mean comical as a synonym for farcical. There's not much amusing about it. The price of this cart alone means that I don't have the manual, and probably never will, so it took me a good while to realize that double tapping a direction causes your fighter to run. There are certain spikes and pits you can't cross without doing a running jump. I messed up a ton, so you don't have to. You're welcome. So, in my moment of slightly embarrassed curiosity, I tried out other button combinations too. It turns out you have more than just your simple palm attack. Double tapping a direction and pressing B is a headbutt. Up and B, in good old Castlevania style, fires this hand projectile that you can collect. The gauge on the bottom tells you how many of these you have left. These are alright, if not much more powerful than your usual attack. The one that is really useful, however, is the sumo stomp thing. Apparently it's called a shiko. You can do this by pressing down and A. This stuns certain enemies and kills others. It's particularly useful against those little ones that are hard to hit. There are 5 areas, each with 3 levels and a final boss. You have health points in the game, which are replenishable by eating the foodstuffs that enemies sometimes drop. Beside the HP gauge is an experience points one, which tells you how many EXP you have and how many you need to level up. There are 3 aspects to power up: your hand attack power, your stomp power, and your health. Boosting your attack power is probably the most important, as this not only governs your strength, but what blocks you can break open. Later on, there are some blocks that those with a low attack level aren't strong enough to break, and you'll miss out on lots of food drops and experience points. The foot stomp isn't very useful to power up, as the regular one can take care of most enemies in the game. An upgraded one can be useful against some bosses, but you certainly don't need it. Focus on the hand attack primarily, with occasional health boosts. I like the way the game looks. The backgrounds are nice, if a little generic, and the enemies are varied, if a little strange. The Japanese-style music fits the theme, obviously, and has a nice pace to it that sounds like something you could punch a smaller man in the face to. The timing of the controls takes a smidge of work to get used to. You'll find that when attacking an enemy, you often take damage yourself too, but it's just a case of getting the timings down. Sumo Fighter is not a bad game at all, but it clearly didn't convince the Western audience too much, as a North American cartridge is pretty rare and, as a result, way overpriced. You're looking at a good $40 at least for the game pack alone. Trust me when I tell you that it's probably not worth it. You can get a Japanese one for way less, and there's no text to read anyway. I bought a US one though. Of course I did. I'd see a therapist about my ridiculous obsession, but between this, Cool World, and Shaq Fu, I can't afford one. NES fans are sure to know this one. One of the most popular sports titles on that system turns out to be the best one yet on this system. You select from 13 teams, not at all based on the lineup for Italian 90. There's no Austria, Scotland, or Romania, amongst others, and France are present despite not actually qualifying for that finals. Your squad is made up of 6 generically named players that could be considered archetypical of the country that you've chosen. For instance, Arthur is the English goalie, and Pierre is holding down the French midfield. You only have one formation to choose from, but you can pick which player plays where, and some rudimentary strategies such as whether to focus on passing or dribbling, or whether your teammates shoot at all. This was a little strange to me the first time I saw it, but then you realise that you only control one player on your team. The other 5 are automated. Games like FIFA do actually have this as a game option these days, but back then it was not the norm. The 6 players on your team line up with 1 keeper, 2 defenders, 1 midfielder, and 2 strikers. This is your only choice, and also P1 only has the option of controlling number 4, the midfielder. This is who you want, as it's not as though positional play is super important. I find myself playing the box-to-box method popularized by primary school kids anyway. Ooh, ball, chase it. Depending on which team you choose and which lineup you go with, the players are faster or slower and have varying chances to win the ball back in a tackle. While these stats aren't shown anywhere, it's quite a marked difference, with Germany being the top guys, fair enough, and Cameroon being the weakest. Roger Miller might have had something to say about that. The game is horizontally focused, with the famous Kunio-kun style of character made famous by Double Dragon and River City Ransom. You know, the ones with the big old craniums? The characters all look slightly different, mainly just the eyes or hairstyles, but it's a nice touch. I love the facial expressions when a player gets tackled. They actually look as if they took a right hook from Jimmy Lee. You can't see the whole pitch at any one time, even widthways, but it works here as you can usually at least see a teammate to pass to, or a couple of opposition players. You pass with A and shoot with B, and while the other team is on the ball, A will shoulder charge and B will attempt a slide tackle. I guess you could say that your controllable number 4 is the team captain, as while the other players are autonomous, you can shout at them to block or slide tackle when defending by pressing the same buttons you'd use to do so yourself, and pass or shoot similarly while attacking. This is cool, and the other guys actually do respond to you with some degree of intelligence. If bearing down on goal, they're not going to pass to you regardless of how many times you scream for it. Just position yourself for a potential rebound and shut your mouth, you dirty glory stealer. It's possible to activate a player's special shots by pressing A and B together. These include bicycle kicks and volleys that are very tough to save, but you only get 5 per match. As you progress through the teams, the pitches change with some pretty funny additions. For instance, when you play Japan, there are boulders that instantly trip a player. There are sandy pitches that slow the balls down, and icy ones that hilariously cause a tackled player to skid off the pitch. Nice touches. And there we have it, one of my hopes fulfilled. A soccer game that's really fun and playable. The lack of realism really helps. The game is totally lawless. Feel free to take out your opponents from behind or elbow them to the head, whatever you want. Oh yes, you have no idea how happy this game makes me. Get in! Honey Bunny has been kidnapped by an evil witch, and it's up to you to... forget it. This time you must collect 8 keys on each level, of which there are 28 in total, in order to open a door at the end. Often keys are in plain sight, dictating the path you need to take. Just as often, however, you need to go into a room, an unlocked one at that, walk along a little bit, collect the key, and walk back out. You gotta love that tacked on longevity, right? Trying to stop you are the traditional roster of Looney Tunes characters. You have a limited number of strategically placed weapons, such as bombs or a bow and arrow, to take them out, but don't waste them. If there's an alternative way to pass an enemy, use it, as later on you'll get assaulted from all sides by the bastards. It's often a good idea to stand at the bottom of a stairwell and wait for an enemy to use them. Crossing on the stairs doesn't kill you, and is often the only way to pass through certain sections. As before, you get an extra life per every level you beat, but if you die, you need to restart the level, including collecting all the keys. There seems to be less choice in your paths. You tend to start at the bottom, working your way linearly to the top, occasionally detouring into these silly little key storage cupboards. There are the same pipes and jump pads, as well as ropes that help bugs bridge gaps. There are now also teleportation pads that take you from one spot to another, but it's all predetermined and isn't really anything other than a prettier way of following a straight line. I still don't get why you would choose Bugs Bunny as the protagonist of a game where you can't jump, but I guess some things just aren't meant to be understood. The graphics are good, but let's be frank, they're recycled from the previous game. Kinda lazy, but then sequels do that all the time. The music is fine, if repetitive, but the thing that'll stick with you like a tick is that "you collected a key" noise. Is there a more annoying soundbite on the whole system? 8 times per level per life? Oh, you cruel, cruel people. Remember how the first Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle game was called Mickey Mouse in Japan? This one is called Mickey Mouse 2 over there. That makes sense, right? Well, in Europe, this one, the sequel, was simply called Mickey Mouse. Not Mickey Mouse Magic Wands, which is something different again. Why do they do this? Did they not consider the sanity of the retrospectively minded reviewers 30 years in the future? Thank Christ for DMG codes, that's all I'll say. Also, as if there weren't enough incarnations of this game, it underwent a sprite swap and was repackaged as Hugo in 1996. Just the sprites though, literally everything else is exactly the same. For a game that's already quite lazy in the first place, this is a fact that leaves a bitter taste in its wake. I'm a grown adult human. By all accounts, I should be excited about clearing my credit card bill, buying a 68-inch TV and a holiday to Cyprus, or getting to test drive the new Toyota Camry. But no, what really gets me going is silly, cutesy little Game Boy puzzle platformers featuring cartoon animals. This was the first version, and there was a Super Nintendo version as well. In North America and Europe, the games launched simultaneously in 1992, but in Japan, the Game Boy title Lucky Monkey was released first. You throw a ball upwards with B. This will come back down, and the idea is to juggle it several times by heading it back up into the air. Doing so several times makes the ball bigger. If you let it hit an enemy, it stuns them for a few seconds, but you can also catch it by pressing B again, which makes it explode into projectiles. These kill whatever enemies are toddling about the place. It might be a bubble, actually, and catching it makes it pop. Whatever it is, the larger the sphere, the bigger the range of projectiles is, hence the more enemies you can kill. There are 4 different sizes. The smallest just creates a small upward shot when you pop it. The next one up makes a larger upward shot. The second largest creates an 8-way blast with a decent radius, and the largest creates a massive 5-ball spread raining down on enemies. These projectiles can take out multiple enemies too, for bigger bonuses. In Bubble Bobble style, when you defeat one of the bad guys, there are these pickups generated. There are B tokens, which are just points, but also these cyclical letters that spell out Spanky. If you can spell out the whole word, you get access to a bonus tower, where you need to juggle this massive bubble up in the air for exponentially more huge scores. Your points total is important. People still cared about that sort of thing in 1991 to get extra lives. Very rarely you can pick up a bottle of medicine with a P on it. This lets you fire sinusoidal bullets for a bit, but it's very rare. Where's the fun in that anyway? You can't ride on bubbles, sadly. That would have been a little too close to another previously mentioned intellectual property, but there are various gameplay elements introduced to you as the stages progress. There are boxing gloves to punch you upwards, as well as clouds to ride on. If you've played the Super Famicom version of this game, you may remember that to complete a level you had to get a key. That's not the case here, you just have to kill all the enemies. They obviously take you out with one touch, but they don't chase you down or anything, they just wander back and forth. Spanky is really cute, and the baddies are just as charming. You'll be fighting garlic cloves, apples, all sorts of odd things. One of the bosses looks like a backside. It's supposed to be a turnip or something, I guess, but let's be honest, it's an arse. There are some nicely animated backgrounds like waterfalls and thunderstorms. The game looks brilliant, and the music is a very pleasant, jazzy, not untypical platform puzzle style. What really impresses me with Spanky's quest is the controls and the physics. It's possible to direct the bubbles by heading them from one side, which is helped by the momentum-based movement of your character. There are some levels that really take some thinking. There weren't a great deal of games that required equal levels of calculation and skill, but you certainly need both here. There's a level in the second tower that requires you to get a bubble to the maximum size, then, still juggling it, jump down a hole and pop it mid-fall to take out otherwise unreachable enemies. They're only on the screen as you're falling. Once you land back on the platform, the levels cycle round if you were wondering, you can no longer see them, never mind hit them. Thankfully, there's no time limit or bubble limit, so keep trying. I'm a total sucker for cute little video game animals, especially monkeys. When they feature in an absolutely top-draw game, I'm content for at least a few hours. Looks great, sounds great, plays even better. Stunning piece of work. I don't know if his name is an innuendo. It must be, right? But Spanky's quest is right up there with the best for me. Now this is a cool one. What at first I thought was some late 70s, early 80s arcade port, am I thinking of Missile Command, is actually a decent little title from the folks over at Seta, the one who brought us the delightfully playable Battle Bull and the tragically tedious Q-Billion. Torpedo Range turned out to be their best Game Boy work as it happens. Despite having such a small portfolio, it was one that was more hit than miss. The aim is to liberate 6 seaports across the globe from surprisingly well-equipped terrorists, who seem to have an arsenal bigger than the armed forces of most countries. You can choose one of 6 bases to start with: USA, USSR, Canada, Australia, UK, and Japan. You pilot a submarine around the globe, it doesn't take long, don't worry, whereby you first need to take out any enemies surrounding a port, in one of 4 different battle styles. Each one will have a star rating underneath it, which relates to the difficulty, with the harder games awarding more points if won. You need to slowly build up your points total in order to buy shields and the ability to carry more torpedoes. You have to do this because freeing the ports takes more ammo than you can hold at the start of the game. There are 4 mini-games to take on, and you can grind as much as you need to between them, choosing the game and the difficulty that suits you best. Note that you don't have to beat all the levels, but it might make the game more interesting if you vary your battles a bit. Firstly, you can take on a battle cruiser. Your sub has surfaced by this point, with the camera behind your sub looking out over a wide swathe of ocean. There will be several cruisers travelling across the screen at various distances that you need to take out by timing your torpedo shots. They're firing back at you, of course, but this isn't a tough mission as long as you take out the closest one first. Come into contact with an aircraft carrier and you're put into a battle against a bunch of fighter jets. There are usually around 5 or 6 planes that fly across the screen in either direction, as well as dodging up and down. You need to fire your torpedoes vertically upwards and take them all out. Each one takes a few hits to down. After they're all shrapnel on the ocean, the aircraft carrier will come out from the background and drop depth charges at you. Take it out to win the battle. You can fire from shallow depths or deep, it's up to you, but bear in mind that the torpedoes travel slower while still in the water. It's pretty satisfying when you time it just right, but don't expect to get it straight away. There's a Hunt for Red October style submarine battle where you take on 3 or 4 other craft in a small area of ocean. This one is too easy, as the AI seems only partly programmed. The enemies don't really come after you, so just pick your prey off one at a time. The final minigame sees you taking on a side-on battleship that has several guns on it. You need to go along destroying them all while avoiding their fire. At times, a ship will also come into view, which you can't destroy, but will drop flammable liquid on the surface of the water, leaving flames that damage you considerably. Once you're leveled up as much as you want, you can try to liberate a port. This takes place in much the same way as the 4th minigame, although this time there are more guns to take down, and they're stronger. Don't enter this final battle until you've got at least 60 torpedoes and 2 super shots. Depending on your dodging skill, I'd probably have at least 12 shields too. The super shots are single-use missiles with a much larger blast radius and do wicked amounts of damage. Aimed just right, they can destroy 2 guns in one strike, so are well worth having. I enjoy the look of the game. While reasonably simple, it's professionally done. The animations of the planes taking off in the background and so on are nice touches. The music can be a little messy at times, but the explosions and torpedo sounds are very cool. Torpedo Range isn't a common title, with the North American version coming quite late in the Game Boy's life cycle, but the Japanese version has little text, and what's there is English anyway. I would wholeheartedly recommend it. A curiosity why there was a 5.5-year gap between the game's first outing and a Western release though. One of those strange anomalies with a reason no doubt lost to time. Based on the anime of the same name, this is a top-down hack-and-slash maze game where your goal is to succeed in a great power struggle and become the strongest samurai or something. It's hard to focus on the story when a cat thief gets hanged from a tree in the intro sequence. What the actual heck, man? This is a kid's game. Gee whiz. Anyway, you basically have to navigate through the levels figuring out these mazes and killing any of the mindless enemies you come across. Pressing B attacks using these 2 swords, but it's pretty clunky and stiff. If an enemy makes contact with you, your eyes pop out in that anime crying style and you can't move for a whole 2 seconds. Why this would be, I don't really know, but it's bloody irritating. The A button does nothing until you get to a boss fight, at which point it can be used to jump. In these mazes, there'll be mini puzzles, such as moving blocks out of the way or finding the destroyable walls. Don't think for a second it's anything akin to The Legend of Zelda, although it probably tried to be. These puzzles are not nearly as well thought out, with a multitude of potential softlocks on the first level alone. You could smash your way into an area and not be able to get back out, forcing a game reset. Very annoying in a game where the emphasis is so obviously on exploration. The combat, as mentioned, is as one note as it comes. You literally just press B to attack, nothing else. You can hold B for what feels like about 20 seconds to do a pathetically weak charge attack, but when every enemy dies in one hit anyway, I can't really work out why this is in. The charge up time is way too long to use against a boss, the only time where it would actually be helpful. Some enemies drop money which can be exchanged in these buildings you'll come across for health refills. No weapon upgrades or anything of that nature, unfortunately. Don't be fooled into thinking there's any kind of RPG element to this game, cause there ain't. Eventually you'll come to a boss. I only saw the first one because I fell asleep not long after. This game is pretty damn tedious. The boss is a joke. He basically does nothing for 90% of the battle, just trying and failing to dodge you, only attacking when his charge meter fills up. I assume they get harder, but I don't have the patience to find out. Let's move on before we all lose our minds. I've never seen an adventure-based game with so little to discover. Very disappointing. What you gonna do, brother, when an overrated, skeleted roid freak runs wild on you? Okay, so I never liked Hulk Hogan, but he's surely the most recognizable name in all of professional wrestling. The first of several licensed Game Boy wrestling games features the sweaty old codger prominently, along with the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, the Ultimate Warrior, and Macho King Randy Savage. He was the king by this point, even though he's tied for second with King Booker, behind King Xavier Woods for me in terms of wrestling royalty. I'm gonna try to not get all wrestling nerdy on your Rudy Poo candy asses, but you must realize that aside from Game Boy, a large part of the 90s for me was spent watching the soap opera that is professional wrestling. I loved it all. WWF, WCW, ECW, the more extreme backyard stuff, everything, so I can't promise. Wrestling games were a little weird back in the day. It was a really hard event to replicate for some reason. Probably not until the 16-bit generations were any of them really proficient. I guess 2 buttons isn't enough, really, and I couldn't truly get on board with anything before the N64's WrestleMania 2000 and the first SmackDown game on the original PlayStation. WWF Superstars looks reasonable for the time, and it uses the limited control options reasonably well. You can move in 4 directions, and pressing left or right twice in quick succession lets your guy run. He'll bounce off the ropes as wrestlers do. The attacks depend on the positions of the 2 wrestlers. If both are standing, A punches and B grapples or slams. It's also possible to throw your opponent to the outside by pressing select, if you're in the right position. This is tough to do, but it causes a lot of damage. There are ground moves that are tough to pull off, as the fighters all no-sell everything, a wrestling term for not playing along. You can full-on body slam someone and they'll immediately get back up. That's just not kayfabe. Anyway, you can elbow drop or stomp a grounded opponent with A, depending on which character you have, and attempt a pinfall with B. If the opponent is trying to get to his feet, you can execute shoulder tosses, suplexes, or pile drivers by pressing B and a direction, or hold B to put the guy in a chokehold. When running, you can dropkick or clothesline your opponents. You can also climb the turnbuckles, but in Ric Flair style it rarely pays off. Executing the top rope splash is tough because the guy just gets up so quickly. It hurts you too if you miss. It's a limited game, sadly. Only 5 wrestlers, none of whom have their signature moves in there. There's no multiplayer mode, and the only match option is a 1 or 3 falls singles match. No tag teams or cages, anything like that. They were focusing on one thing at a time, I guess. The controls are alright, you'll get used to them after a while anyway. This game serves as a decent framework for later wrestling games. The chiptune mock-ups of the wrestlers' entrance themes were a bit hit and miss. Hogan's and Warriors sound like the actual songs, but I can't really identify Mr. Perfect's music, and Ted DiBiase's is a little shonky too. It's really nice fan service to put them in there though. The game looks as good as it probably could do. Well, we'll see whether I'm right later on, I'm sure, as there were quite a lot of licensed wrestling games on the Game Boy. And the close-ups of the 5 wrestlers are immediately identifiable and well drawn. They even let Hogan keep his wrinkly old skull covered up by the bandana, which is a good choice because his shriveled up chrome dome has always grossed me out. Someone left the kitchen window open and honey all over the counter. Now, the kitchen is full of bugs. You have to jump around the place with a can of Dr. Killigan's, murdering the poor blighters. The stuff of nightmares take on human-sized mosquitoes, cockroaches, flies, and worms that endlessly spawn. I think, based on the intro, that you prayed to God to give you the power to kill his creations, and in his infinite wisdom, you've been shrunk down to their size, which surely would make defeating them that much harder. Who knows? You only have to kill enough to reach your quota per level, at which point a door will appear that you can use to move on. If you care about points, you can hang around and keep spraying. The can is infinite and there's no time limit. Sometimes when you kill one, it'll turn into a block with a sun, a star, or a moon on it. You can push these into other bugs to squash them, for more bonus points and increases to your health. If you can line up 3 of the same block, you'll get massive points. There are bonus levels thrown in every now and then where you flip over cards to make pairs, and also a couple of boss fights to break up the monotony. Eventually, you'll make it to the final boss, Big Mouse, who is the criminal mastermind who somehow managed to unite insectdom beneath his rule and is also vulnerable to pesticide for some reason. The controls are alright, although the movement is a little too slippery for my liking. You'll take damage frequently at first by overshooting where you intended to land. Otherwise, there's not a great deal more to say about Kitchen Panic. It is what it is. Another in the long line of insane game premises with underwhelming execution and overly repetitive gameplay. With what appears to be becoming a tagline of sorts, I'll finish with this. You might get some fun out of this for a short while. A strangely uninspired use for a popular franchise comes in the form of yet another falling block puzzle game, this time featuring Hello Kitty. It feels exceptionally similar to Dr. Mario, but was somehow largely botched. You have 2 rotatable 2-piece blocks with 5 possible faces on it. You need to make a horizontal or vertical row of 3 or more of the same face. Any longer than 3 gives you bonus points, and if you can chain them, you'll get even more. A rotates clockwise, B counterclockwise. The controls are a little too quick, meaning it's frequent to overshoot and place blocks further along than you meant to. This gets frustrating as it's really hard to counteract due to how irregularly it happens. The board is quite cramped and will fill up very quickly. This drastically reduces the strategy you're able to carry out. Think how in Dr. Mario the pieces were quite small, and you had a lot of flexibility when it comes to carrying out your moves. This is not the case here, and once the speed has increased as the game goes on, you just don't have nearly enough time to plan where you want to move blocks, never mind actually do it. How a Hello Kitty game was made so ugly is beyond me. It's literally the cutesiest IP in existence, to the point where it's almost saccharine. The music is quite irritating and there are no sound effects. You've played better versions of this before, so don't feel bad about skipping Sanrio Carnival. One of the most bizarre takes on the Rescue the Girl storyline is on offer in The Adventures of Star Saver. Called Rubble Saver in Japan, which makes the game sound like a really lame paleontology thing, you play as Tony, a police officer who, along with his sister, are forced to go inside a UFO by a group of aliens who are planning to invade the galaxy. After they refuse to spy on the people of Earth, they are both exiled to a faraway planet. It's now up to Tony to figure out how this strange world works, stop the aliens, and save his sister along the way. Luckily, a sentient robot mech with vast knowledge of telepathic skills is here to help. You start in your mech suit, and in Ghosts and Goblins style, getting hit once reduces you to your human. At least he's not in his underpants. Jumping onto a P block allows you to regain your suit. Your firepower can be upgraded to a spread shot if you're in the mech. Your dude will only ever have the basic shot, but can fire rapidly with the power-up. Pressing B fires and A jumps. The game places a lot of emphasis on jumping to small platforms. There's not a great deal of walking on solid ground, and many of these little floating islands are moving too, so expect to fall a lot. However, the game throws you a lifeline, literally, because you can collect these tokens that have what looks like a bow and arrow on them. These are called life arrows that will grab onto the nearest platform, pulling your mech or human onto it. They're not unlimited though, and as you'd expect are less widely available on later levels. If you press A and B together, a life arrow will shoot out in the direction you are holding in a kind of bionic commando style, allowing you to reach platforms easier. You can collect a lion's head, which renders you invincible for a short time. The surrealist nature of the enemies is a nice touch. You'll be battling musical notes, mechanical hedgehogs, a dog which seems docile but starts chasing you if you jump over him, enemies that split up when you kill them, figure out which ones these are and don't stand too close. The levels aren't solely a left to right job, but will often take you up and down as well as back on yourself. You start jumping from planet to moon to planet, pay no attention to the obvious size discrepancies. Having a black background here to represent space was a brave choice, as the screen blur could have made the game very tough to play. It isn't too bad though, and by the second level you're against a white one anyway. The level of detail in the graphics is rather nice, but you get a considerable amount of lag sometimes. This can often result in your control inputs being swallowed. After beating the first level, which is pretty straightforward, you fight a boss. The bosses in the game are ordered excellently in terms of difficulty, as the first one is very easy, but don't expect the later ones to be. Bear in mind, however, that you don't start where you left off if you die, you go back to the most recent checkpoint. Similar to a Mario title, this is usually either the start or the midway point. Like Mario 2, you can only usually take one hit before needing to re-power up. From space, you progress through varied alien arenas across 9 levels. Each level has a bonus stage where you ride a moving platform and have to shoot at blocks. These are useful to get points for extra lives, but are more beneficial due to the fact that beating one teleports you to near the end of the level. I got majorly stuck on level 7. Nothing I did to the boss would kill it. It's this kind of squid thing that keeps turning the lights out. I'm certain it can be killed, but have read reports that it's invulnerable. So you need to find a bonus stage that takes you past it. Consulting the FAQ to find this out does feel a little cheap, and I know that that goddamn squid is laughing at me. I couldn't come this far without trying to beat the game though. I'm agonizingly close. I can't for the life of me get through the boss on World 8. It's this giant robot lobbing these boulders at you, and is pretty tough. I enjoy the game enough to keep trying though. It's a real shame about the lag because other than that, the game looks very nice. Possibly the backgrounds are often a bit plain at first, but they improve with time. Sound-wise, The Adventures of Star Saver is pretty good, with some great sound effects and music that changes depending on whether or not you're wearing the suit. The platforming is tricky but always fair, and the controls are tight. A solid platformer that has a sequel coming soon, Rubble Saver 2, or Max as you may know it. Not a bad one to have. Get up, G-Arms. Search for love and peace. Fine words we can all live by there. There's no love nor peace in this game, however. It's hard to even find out what this game is about, as there seems to be about 5 different titles for it. The intro sequence freeze frames are actually cool, very dark and atmospheric, and excellently drawn. That's as far as my compliments extend, however. This is a top-down action shooter where you control a Gundam mecha and have to destroy other mechas in this playground-sized arena filled with junk. You fire a spread shot with A and can extend these drill things with B. Destroying an enemy brings out a little ball who is supposed to represent the pilot, or driver, whatever. Kill this to defeat the enemy entirely before the ball can find another mech suit. The same applies to you. If your suit is destroyed, you become a similar little ball that is killed in one shot, and you basically have to flee for your life and find another suit. The hitboxes of you and your enemy's suits are oversized, meaning it's very easy to hit things, but nigh impossible to avoid things. The weapons are pathetically weak, however, needing a good 20 shots to break an enemy. The attack you need to use is the drills. This can destroy a suit pretty quickly, but the range is very small. There are usually 2 enemies in an arena. They'll respawn for a bit on destruction, but eventually they'll disappear and you complete the level. The controls are so stiff and far too strictly adhering to the cardinal directions for the game to feel smooth at all. It's difficult to move into the desired position, and when you get there, the combat is as redundant as a button masher ever was. So, another Gundam game, another massive opportunity flushed away. It's like Bandai didn't know what they wanted their Gundam renditions to be, so they tried everything and ended up doing nothing. They seemingly used a similar tactic when naming the bloody things. It's a change in style from whatever the hell Kunitori Monogatari was. Kudos, I guess, for attempting a different genre. Unfortunately, SD Command Chronicles Operation Gundam G-Arms, or whatever it's called, is still so far from a playable game. Too brutal, too clunky, too confusing, and an absolute waste of time and resources. Not to mention an IP with so much potential. Possibly the best known name in the world of Game Boy turn-based strategy games is Nintendo's own Game Boy Wars. Sadly, it's also one of the most inconvenient to play, where all three of its sequels, Game Boy Wars Turbo and Game Boy Wars 2 and 3, have all had the translation treatment. At time of writing, this one still hasn't. It's weird that Nintendo of America would greenlight the release of Nobunaga's Ambition, a game with little relevance to the Western world, but not Game Boy Wars. Perhaps it was because of the limited relevance. Perhaps this one hit a little too close to home in the war-ravaged world of 1991. This is a sequel to Famicom Wars, but really the series didn't gain a massive amount of traction until its descendant, Advance Wars, on the GBA. It's a turn-based military strategy game where you command either the army of the star or the moon, with whatever real-life connotations you want to make yourself, in an attempt to take over the scenario by capturing buildings and killing enemy troops. This was far from the earliest example of a military strategy game, but it was arguably one of the first to make it a big deal, in Japan anyway. This is probably due to its simplicity. There's no in-depth, brain-racking tactics needed to employ. You can be pretty gung-ho and still do alright. It's a more accessible game than some of the others around at the time. You don't have all of these intricate little pieces with their own skills and strengths. All you have to contend with are tanks, soldiers, anti-aircrafts, and so on. It's immediately obvious just by looking at the icons what the strengths and weaknesses will be. One thing you might notice straight away is that the grid here is not square. The tiles are square, sure, but the layers are offset, meaning you're actually playing on a hexagonal grid. This opens up many more movement options. It makes it so much easier to place yourself adjacent to an enemy you want to attack, as you're not punished for moving on the diagonal. Think how it's done in Civilization, and you'll see what I mean. The options are plentiful. You can choose whether each team is controlled by a player or a CPU, meaning you can have a link cable-free two-player experience, go one-on-one with the AI, or even watch a battle play out without any control. The maps vary depending on if you play one or two player, but either way there are a lot to choose from. You can choose whether to supply your troops manually or automatically. Automatic is more accessible, but choosing manual allows more in-depth tactical play. Pressing A over your base allows you to build a unit, depending on your current resource level. Otherwise, click on a unit and move it within its range. You need to capture resources to earn money, which allow you to build the units, amongst other things. Typically, this will be the buildings you see. The grey ones are currently not aligned to a side and are ready to be captured. Capture as many buildings as you can before the enemy. Money is very important, so make sure you claim it. The game is reasonably forgiving. You can save at any time with the inbuilt battery. You'll need to as well, because these battles can drag something fierce at times. If the map is a large one, don't expect to be thrown straight into a gunfight. Both armies are going to have to slog their way to each other over many turns. Game Boy Wars isn't really my go-to when choosing a turn-based strategy game, and there are a few reasons. Sure, the Japanese is a little bit of a problem, although the most basic hiragana knowledge should be enough to at least tell you what the units are. It's an accessible game, but for anyone with moderate strategy game experience, you might find the whole thing just a little too restrictive. The pace of the game struggles at times as well. Having said all that, Game Boy Wars is actually pretty good, and it started a franchise that turned out to be a big deal, especially on portable consoles. I think the main reason for me is I prefer the separation that a fantasy world-based game gives you. I'd much rather command an army of goblins into battle than an army of actual people. Maybe I'm too sensitive, who knows. In name and characters only, this is a Japan-only sequel to the 1989 trap-em-up Boomer's Adventures in Asmik World. Boomer's back, but this time, his job is to reach an exit somewhere in each puzzle by assembling all of the designated road sections he's been given into a route that circumnavigates obstacles, all the while stopping the little children from being kidnapped. You can see in the bottom left corner of the screen what road pieces you have to use, and it's obligatory to use all of them, I'm afraid. No cutting straight for the most direct path. You'll really have to think about this. The exit you're aiming for might be a door or a cave entrance, but it may also simply be an arrow pointing off screen somewhere. If this is the case, you also have to approach the arrow from the correct angle. It's self-explanatory once you see it, but not an easy feat. It's not hard to mess up. You can frequently use too few pieces, or try to forge a path to a place that you don't have the right sections available for. The way the sections are laid down is pretty simple in that you don't have to choose the correct bit, rather just the place where you want to go. The game will put the right piece down automatically, so long as you have one. If you do make a mistake, press A and a directional button, retracing your steps to undo the route taken. It's not as simple as that, though. Honestly, were that the entire concept, it would not make that interesting an affair. There are enemies all over the field, and they're hungry. The reason you're building these roads is so that your little ones can walk out of their caves to the end. Once they leave the sanctuary of their cave, they're vulnerable, however. If an enemy grabs your child, it'll eventually drag it off. If this happens, you lose a life. You're not completely helpless, though. Press B, not A, as it'll delete the route, and a direction to navigate to where the kidnapping is taking place. Run into the enemy to engage them in a battle. This takes you to a different screen, where the aim is to plant bombs in order to defeat the nasty child snatchers. There are other special items as well. If you succeed, the enemy will skulk away, leaving your bairn behind. Lose all your energy, however, and you'll be stunned for a few seconds, which will almost certainly result in them being taken captive. There are usually various solutions to each puzzle. Each stage can be split into different screens as well, with later levels being longer. In fact, the last level is something like 18 screens. The fourth in each world harbours a boss, but none of them are hard. It's always just a case of dodging their pre-scripted routes and planting enough bombs to blow them away. After each stage you get a password, and there are 4 worlds with 4 stages each. The passwords aren't just random letters, they spell out a little message once you mesh them all together. Boomer and his children must reach the sacred altar to fulfill their destiny for Asmik-Kun World. The controls take a little while to comprehend, which can, in moments of panic, lead to real frustration. For instance, when you're at one end of the screen and your kids get hassled, chirping away. It's easy at first to get totally muddled trying to get back to save them, but not moving anywhere. You need to first choose where to put a piece by using the D-pad to select the tile relative to you, then press A to place it. It's tough at first, but should hopefully become natural after not too long. Decent enough graphics and not unpleasant puzzle-gamey music accompanies what is a completely different experience to the first Boomer game on Game Boy, and while this is certainly more interesting than the trap-em-up experience from before, it's let down a little by the initial control confusion hump, and after a while the gameplay does start to feel a little stale. Slogging through 10 or more screens in one go can be a pain. Not bad for what it is, though. Here come the Madcap Snow Brothers. Well, no, actually. Being as it is a Game Boy game, Tom has mysteriously vanished in King Scorch's Ice Palace. More chilling news. That's the manual's pun, not mine. The sun is burning out. Now it's up to Nick to rescue his brother and save the heart of the sun. Snow Bros. Jr. plays virtually the same as the NES version, with only a tiny handful of gameplay elements taken away. There are 50 floors to this palace, with a boss every 10 floors. You play as Nick the Snowman, whose goal on each floor is to wipe out all the enemies by encasing them in a snowball and then punting them before they break out. If it sounds an awful lot like Bubble Bobble, that's because it is. You jump with A and throw little snowballs with B. You fire an infinite barrage of snow clods at the enemy. Each one takes 4 or 5 to completely encase them. You can stall them with 1 or 2, which also makes them temporarily harmless, but to be able to kick them, you need to fully trap them. The cool feature about this comes when you kick the ball. They will fly from side to side across the level and drop down through holes, taking out other enemies along the way, before ultimately splattering on a wall. You gain a small points bonus for each wall it rebounds off. It's possible to clear whole stages out by doing this, which is incredibly gratifying, and each enemy you run down gives a little bonus sweet or potion, so it's worth trying to do. You can hit a trapped enemy from underneath to knock it up to a higher level, meaning you can potentially kick an enemy from the very top and hit all the others on a level. If you manage to clear out all the monsters in one shot, these dollar bills float down from the top, giving a ton of points. Another inventive little mechanic that comes along with this is Nick can hitch a ride with these fast-moving snowballs if he stands in the way of it. It doesn't hurt you, and you can jump out of the ball at any time using A, but it's a cool and occasionally useful way to move about the level. I briefly mentioned the potions that drop when you chain hit enemies. They're actually hot sauce. I'm not going to get into the judgment of a man with a largely frozen constitution to eat something that would exacerbate his melting. What these do is increase the size of your projectiles, meaning fewer are needed to encase the enemies. There's also one that speeds you up. Once, a bottle turned the character into a massive floating version of himself. I assume this allows you to deal instant damage, but seeing as how I've only seen it one time after I cleared the level out already, I can't be certain. The levels are mostly one screen, and there's no screen wrapping like in other games of this style, until the later levels. I adore the sprite animations. Rather than just jumping like all other platforming mascots, Nick does a kind of parkour front flip thing. It doesn't affect the movement in any way that you wouldn't expect, but it looks nice. If you partially trap an enemy but they then break out, they'll shake off the cold and snow with a stunned shiver. Again, it doesn't mean much, but it's a cute little touch. There are lots of different enemies, some of which fire at you, from birds to monkeys to these goblin-like creatures. They all have slightly different movements, but are all killed in the same way. The bosses are inventive, but the general principle is that you ball up the little critters that they spew out at you, and then pelt them back at the big guy. The controls are perfect, and the difficulty curve is exactly right. I like that the snow you throw kind of follows gravity a little. It'll go along horizontally for a bit, but then drop downwards. Pay attention to this because if you position yourself just right, you can actually trap enemies patrolling a lower level than you. Useful in a pinch. This game has become more sought after in the past few years. It's going for a pretty penny. Ever more so the more people realise how great it is. It's not nearly at the astronomically ridiculous height of the NES cartridge yet, and as this version is probably better anyway, I certainly would buy Snow Bros. Jr. if you ever get the chance. It's one of those that I wouldn't mind spending a little more on, because it's so addictive. The controls and gameplay fit the console perfectly. You can play it in short bursts, it uses the entirety of the small screen. The cutscenes tell the story of the war after every boss, and they look bloody gorgeous. This is one that you need, I would say. Do I like this better than Bubble Bobble? I think I actually do. So good. From the darkest recesses of an architect's fever dream comes a port of one of the more unique arcade titles from the 80s. The aim is to skillfully control this marble to the end goal of increasingly tricky obstacle courses. The stages are laid out in a three-dimensional isometric style. There are plenty of opportunities to smash your marble to bits by dropping it from too high a height or off one of the sides into oblivion. It'll always respawn where you lost it, but this takes a few seconds and the time limit is pretty strict. The quicker you beat a stage, the more time you'll have to carry over to the next one, so you need to make haste even on the easier levels. There are these things that look like slinkies but are a kind of leech that eats your ball, and patches of ooze that slither about that you need to avoid. The first thing to get used to is the gravity. Your ball gathers speed pretty quickly when going downhill, and correcting its motion takes a great deal of precision and skill. It's quite impressive how responsive the controls are. It's certainly not easy, but you never feel conned because of bad controls. The original arcade version used a trackball to control the marble, giving a full 360-degree directional movement. Obviously, the home ports, of which there are many, use a D-pad for the most part, but the feeling was usually replicated well. You can choose between 45-degree or 90-degree controls. The 45-degree one requires you to push down to move the marble diagonally down and to the left, leaving right to move you diagonally down and to the right. I can never get my head around this scheme for isometric games because the levels are laid out diagonally, but you don't press the arrows diagonally to move it that way. Not a fan at all, but different strokes and all that. Choosing 90 degrees allows you to move left by pressing left, and so on. Sure, you'll be holding two directions a lot of the time, but you won't have to overcome that natural instinct of wanting to move in the direction you push. There are 5 levels in all, which loop until you eventually run out of time. They all go from the top corner down to the bottom, except the final stage, which runs the other way. Gravity's been reversed here as well, meaning the marble accelerates up the hills. The Game Boy version of Marble Madness is really rather good. I'm not massively au fait with how processor-hungry a game that looks like this is. Maybe it's not at all, but the system pulls off the isometric effect really well, and a game that had the potential to be hard to visualize actually looks great. The light and shade is more emphasized, which compensates for the lack of color while retaining the depth. The classic atmospheric soundtrack is done well. I've always got a strange The Adventures of Mark Twain vibe from the sound and aesthetics in Marble Madness. No idea why, and it's no different here. A faithful representation of a game that's always hard to beat, but is certainly unique, and is 100% skill-based from start to finish. It seems like something that should be easy, but it's really not. Not for me, at least. I don't know about you, but I'm such a klutz in this game, and it often leaves me feeling like there's something wrong with my basic motor functions. On November the 12th, 1984, approximately 4 months before Mikhail Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union, a Russian Typhoon-class submarine surfaced briefly in the Atlantic, just north of Bermuda. It subsequently sank in deep water after suffering massive radiation leakage. Unconfirmed reports indicate some of the crew were rescued. According to repeated statements from both Soviet and American governments, nothing of what you are about to see ever happened. Whoa. In this rendition of a classic Sean Connery movie, you control Red October, the submarine, through 8 cavernous stretches of ocean. You basically need to get to the end of these underwater cave systems without getting blown up, where you'll fight a boss. There are lots of other submarines, battle cruisers, helicopters, all sorts of nasties trying to stop you. They're totally ruthless too, and don't give you a second's respite. You fire torpedoes back at them with B, and also have a limited supply of stronger homing missiles that you fire with A. The controls are similar to Choplifter 2 in that pressing backwards, i.e. the opposite to the direction you're moving in, one time will allow you to reverse while still attacking in that direction. Pressing it a second time turns you around. The physics are suitably underwatery, with a decent drag feeling that means momentum will build over a short time rather than being instant. The bosses are a little strange. Some are little more than sequence fights where you have to destroy parts of a huge construct in order, removing layer after layer until the battle's done. Others are your standard monstrous creation that's both bigger and vastly stronger than you, but can still be taken down with your ordinary fire. The music is decent, but my word is it repetitive. You'll be hearing that small collection of tunes again and again. The explosions are done well, which is fortunate as there are a lot of them in this game. I don't mind the graphics. The radar is very helpful and looks great, and the hit detection is very good, which is an achievement in and of itself because of how irregular the rock formations are. It can't have been straightforward to program that. Sure, what you're looking at isn't amazingly varied, but it can definitely be put in the good drawer. There is a reason that I won't be playing The Hunt for Red October too much after this review, however. It's not the presentation, which, as I've already said, is decent. It's not the storyline, because while it doesn't follow the plot of the movie that much, other than the start sequence, the source material is a great film and lends itself excellently to an atmospheric experience. No, the biggest problem with this game is the difficulty. It's so unforgiving. I've got to level 3 a couple of times, but never further. It's just too hard. Now, I don't mind challenge, as I've said many times, but I feel like a little kid getting picked on by the bigger boys. The Soviet forces are relentless, brutal bastards who are everywhere. It doesn't matter if you can see them or not, because they'll just wipe you out. I only got as far as I did by playing the coward, hiding in crevices and sneaking out when there were no rockets heading my way. Progress is almost completely reliant on collecting power-ups. There are ones that heal you, ones that give you more missiles, a caterpillar drive thing that stops the enemies from spotting you for a short time, and occasional extra lives. The thing is, these can be destroyed by enemy torpedoes, or even your own, which is infuriating. Enemies take several hits to destroy, you have to be face to face with them, and they're firing back at you. It's nigh impossible to take out a sub with your ordinary weapon without taking damage yourself. The unforgiving level of difficulty makes this more stressful than enjoyable, and that's not what video games should be about. Also known on some platforms as Nebulous, Castelian is a somewhat unique platform game where you play as a pig, frog, mouse thing called Julius. You have to climb to the summit of 8 colossal towers and plant D-bombs, it's not rude, to bring these alien constructions to the ground and save your island. As Julius climbs and leaps across the face of each tower, he is confronted by hordes of geometric enemies such as the spherical eyeballs and spheroids, and hexalons. Guess what shape they are? So rather than climbing the interior of the towers, you're working your way around the perilous edges, trying to avoid these enemies and dissolving platforms. What sets Castelian apart from an ordinary platformer is the level layouts. The sprite of your character doesn't move as such, but stays rooted to the center space of the screen, and the tower rotates behind you clockwise or counterclockwise, giving an impressive level of depth. It doesn't sound like something that would work on the Game Boy, but it's surprisingly effective. You can shoot something called carbono bombs, a weapon purported to be made from a substance harder than diamond. You have unlimited ammo for these, and they can be used to take out certain threats and remove flashing blocks from your way. Still, not all enemies are affected by it, some you'll just have to hide from or otherwise avoid. Any contact will knock you down to a lower platform. If you end up in the sea, well, you die. It's hard to swim with no arms, I suppose. The dissolving platforms have no telegraphs. All of a sudden they'll just fall from under you. Your only choice is to memorize their location. The tower has several doors that lead you to other parts of the tower, and elevator platforms that you press up or down to activate while stood on. Get to the end of a level, a big ask, and you can enter a bonus stage, whereby you run from left to right as quickly as you can while also collecting jewels. This gives you extra lives, but the quicker you complete each stage, the more bonus time you can take into the following tower, so they're worth doing. It all sounds like something that could work, and sure, the game was reasonably popular on home computers. The problem here is the obscene difficulty. You can't ever expect to beat a level without having first died 100 times, getting slightly further each life, and just learning the whole thing by rote. It comes across as a puzzle game, but there's little strategy to be had anywhere. You just move about as quickly as you can in trial and error fashion, trying to avoid the ridiculous onslaught of shapes flying at you. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention that this game has one of the stingiest time limits I've ever come across. If you fall but one time, there's basically no way you'll get to the top. When you run out of time, you die. When you die, you start over. No checkpoints anywhere. Sorry to say, Mr. Pig Frog thing, you're on your own with this one. I don't care about your silly little island enough to put myself through Castelian.
Oh gosh, Minnie, I have a present for you, haha!
You can guess what happens. Big Bad Pete has stolen it. So, enlisting the help of Goofy, you need to progress through the levels to get it back. Starting off in Mickey's hometown, you soon find yourself in a shopping mall, crossing a lake, through some woods, up a mountain. They weren't kidding with the name Dangerous Chase. The game strongly reminds me of the fantastic Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers on the NES, a game that I really wish made it to the Game Boy. You can control either Mickey or Minnie, and in the same way that the chipmunks could pick up crates and apples and hurl them at the enemies, you can do the same here. Pick up a block and lob it horizontally or vertically at an enemy, and they fly diagonally off the screen. There are lots of stars scattered across the levels, of which if you collect 100 you get an extra life. There are stars and health pickups in special blocks, 4 of which per level also harbour these treasure orbs. If you can find all 4 and then complete the level, you get an extra life. The screen scrolls from left to right, and you can only backtrack a very short distance, so if you overshoot a bonus orb, then I'm afraid you're not getting it. The third level sees your mouse in a speedboat on a lake, having to avoid rocks and flying fish in an auto-scroller to Goofy on the other side. That's the thing, Goofy's always waiting for you at the end of the level, which makes me wonder why he's making Mickey go through such an ordeal. When you finally get to fight Pete at the end, he's a joke. He just jumps back and forth, hide on the right-hand side of the screen, and he throws balls the other way. There's no AI, just a strict, unwavering pattern that he follows. There's a nice variation of enemies, from angry dogs to flying squirrels, from snakes to bears. The game looks lovely with a real Disney charm, detailed backgrounds and cartoonish sprites. The music has the same quality you expect from a Disney game. It's no DuckTales, but then not many soundtracks are. There's enough variation in the gameplay elements to ensure you're not just repeating yourself. A solid title that finally gave Mickey something interesting to do rather than just going around a castle collecting keys. Something of a relief, I'd say. If they're anything like this one, I'm looking forward to reaching Magic Wands and Ultimate Challenge.